Hi, my name is Tony McLaughlin, and I'm talking to Rafa Plantier from Tink today. Rafa, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Tony.
Rafa, tell us a little bit about your background and then perhaps a little bit more about Tink.
Sure. I'm originally from Brazil. I've been working in financial services for the last 15 years. My mom is a COBOL software programmer, and my father was a developer of hardware designing ATMs and bank automation. So I kind of come from a household where financial infrastructure was really a household topic.
Great.
So not surprising that I end up in this industry. I worked for a major bank for 5 years, and then along with other people founded a merchant acquiring business in Brazil for 4 years, and then joined Stripe payments company for nearly 5 years, and I've been with Tink for over a year now.
Fantastic. Your mum's programming skills on COBOL must be still in high demand.
They are, unsurprisingly, but and globally, interestingly. But yes, absolutely. she's still working.
And tell me a little bit more about Tink.
Absolutely. Tink is arguably Europe's largest open banking platform. We've been in this market since 2012, which precedes a lot of the industry marquee events like the CMA9 order in this country, or the PSD2 in Europe, or GDPR. So we are one of these companies that have been creating the path towards what we now call open banking. And we actually started our journey as a B2C app in Sweden. Doing what we now call account aggregation and payment initiation. And over time, and particularly after PSD2 and GDPR, after the Payment Service Directive or privacy law, as the B2B market of open banking opened up, and it's particularly more recently as banks have moved from a mode of deploying the compliance of open banking, sort of the outbound part of open banking, more focused on the inbound opportunities. We've pivoted the company towards being 100% B2B. So since 2017, everyone at Tink is now focused on empowering our partners. And that really ranges from the largest financial institutions in Europe. So organizations like SEB, Nordea, BNP Paribas, ABN AMRO, the NatWest Group, to leading fintechs like the PayPal Group or Klarna, to thousands of independent developers and smaller fintechs. And we have about 5,000 of those live in our platform. So we're quite happy with the scale of the business. We now cover 14 countries, so pretty much that's pretty much all of Western Europe. It's over 2,500 connections, and ultimately, which means that if by integrating to Tink, you can have access to over 250 million bank customers in Europe.
Yeah, so that's super interesting. So Tink is a kind of an aggregator of open banking APIs, because PSD2, CMA9, as you mentioned in the UK, called for individual banks to publish APIs for account information and for payment initiation. And so that means that organizations like Tink have moved into the space between those API endpoints and those who would want to consume them. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's correct. That's correct. And actually, for my background in payments, what Tink does is very similar, just changing verticals, but to what players like Stripe do on the payment space, right? You actually have sort of more direct routes in individual countries or individual payment methods, but developers choose to go through APIs that not only they function as aggregators, but they typically have value-added services on top of those APIs. In our case, and that's quite a large part of our company, we have a whole range of data products that help businesses like banks and fintechs to extract more value from the data that they can get through open banking. So these are things from how do you do categorization of transactions, how do you do deduplication, so a lot of the actual data science groundwork, all the way to financial insights. So how do you design these statistical models that can identify behavior over this financial data that has been exchanged with the customer's consent.
And Rafa, what's the state of play in terms of the quality of the bank's APIs? I think that many of the banks were in, dare I say, compliance mode during PSD2. Some may have put forward the bare minimum APIs to be compliant. Are the APIs published by the banks usable?
That really varies by country. So first of all, if you look across the whole EEA, where this is encompassing, markets like the UK, that is largely true. I think, interestingly, you have this staged level of compliance where typically a market will focus on having the bare minimum APIs, and then the industry regulators and the banks themselves will then focus more on, okay, how's the authentication journey? Is there anything that we can do there? And from that perspective, I think the Nordics and the UK is probably leading Europe. But over the last 12 months, we've seen Spain, France, Italy, Portugal, several other Western European markets catch up in a way. I think Eastern Europe is still quite fragmented, and Germany as well. But making progress, especially on the larger institutions.
Okay, and my understanding is that for the time being, at least, in terms of the different parts of open banking, there's access to account information, and there's payment initiation. My understanding is that so far the greatest degree of usage is coming from the access to the account information. Is that right?
That's right, and I think the reason for that is the primary demand for open banking has been the exchange of financial data. Arguably, that's where the alternative is the poorest, right? If you think of the mortgage journey today, so you come into this country, or you're a point of your life that you want to get a mortgage, the prototypical experience is that you actually print bank statements and you submit to a broker or to a bank directly. So it's as you can imagine, this will all these papers will arrive at an op center where this will be digitized and so on. And the gap between that and a Face ID on a smartphone of the account aggregation journey is so big that the demand towards those services have been great. I think we're now seeing payment initiation pick up. And an interesting contrast here is, while arguably the UK has the best standards, because it set up this entity responsible for developing and enforcing standards, which is a quite different approach to the other banks, also given the sort of a path dependency in this country of how open banking came to be, really, with the CMA9 order. I would actually argue that in the Nordics, you see more traction across all these products. That's where, when we look at our client portfolio in the Nordics, for example, we have things like insurance companies, retailers, rewards programs, and government itself. I think we're going to see this realization that open banking is really the solution for the financial exchange of data, and really payment initiation can solve areas where the current payments industry or infrastructure is not really set out for. And we're going to see more traction in those. But I do think it's fair to say that it progresses. It tends to, if you look at countries and not companies individually, it tends to progress with the quality of account aggregation increasing and then payment initiation. And I think we're happy to be one of these companies that are pushing that outer boundary of the industry. We've gone live with payment initiation in some markets where we were the first ones, and the first few months is a lot of groundwork with banks and with fintechs.
And one of the issues with the payment initiation, I feel like customer journey, also with account aggregation, is the strong customer authentication, and whether the banks are delivering a good customer journey through that authentication or not. What's the state of play with the banks in terms of improving the quality of their strong customer authentication so that users of open banking can have a good customer experience?
Yeah, this has been a really important year for that. I think there's a now growing consensus that banks have to provide the same level of experience between their direct channels and the industry APIs, or anything generated from the industry APIs, which means that and this is being enforced now by national competent authorities throughout Europe. And the result of that is, I hope, is is a run towards the best user experience.
Yeah.
Because what's the moment that there's no degradation of the experience by using third-party providers, I think customers, as they are in some extent doing today, are going to go with the user experience that best meet their needs. So we are seeing, partly because of regulatory or trade pressure, but also partly because I think more institutions realize that it is important for them that they are participants in this ecosystem that's been growing around open banking, and by having a poorer authentication method that they will have on their own mobile apps, they're not helping themselves.
Yeah. So that's a fascinating point also to map in this journey, which is, when will banks start to see that open banking is not just a regulatory project that they should comply with, but actually something which is a business opportunity for banks as well as for fintechs? What will be the catalyst for getting to that point where the banks actually embrace open banking and move beyond the regulatory bare minimums?
It's interesting. I would say the first catalyst is for them to meet and feel comfortable with having met the regulatory or the compliance side of open banking,
yes.
The regulatory mandate. Because I understand this is actually, we see this very clearly in the market, where this first wave of compliance, banks were very risk averse because they felt they were in a very tight, and arguably so a tight timeline to deliver something that is not true of their operations at large, right? If you think about just the back-end systems of banks, they haven't been designed in the cloud. These are not real-time programmatic solutions across the board. So to be able to an enforcement of less than 4 years to make that a reality across all of their payment accounts was quite a high bar. So as banks have delivered this, it's very we see this trend of not just a changing mindset, but also changing who gets engaged in open banking, right?
Yes.
I think this first phase, you typically have a open banking division, someone who's head of open banking, and that person is accountable, maybe accountable for opportunities as well, but largely accountable for the compliance side of open banking. And I think what happens in this type of settings is that people will tend to cover the bases first and be sure that they're not putting their institutions at risk. Yes. And interesting, I think this creates opportunities for the whole industry, because the set of skills, the way you deploy is quite different if you are trying to meet a regulatory requirement versus you're shooting for the best user experience or becoming a more active player in the ecosystem. So we tend to join conversations with banks at this stage, really, when they go from the outbound open banking focus to the inbound and start saying, okay, what can I do from a consent-based financial data exchange?
I'm sure that's true. I'm sure that sooner or later we'll get to the point where banks fully embrace APIs and join the API economy, absolutely fully. But my final question to you on the business front is this, which is, imagine that you were giving advice to a regulator in another country. I know that, for example, your home country of Brazil is embarking on its open banking journey. What advice do you give to a regulator in terms of how to go about open banking? How do you get banks to go willingly into open banking? How do you make sure that you don't only have delivered the minimum APIs? What's the appropriate policy stance towards bringing open banking into a market in such a way that you get maximum innovation and maximum participation from the banks?
I'll say people always get concerned with change and think that others or the industry, or you can even think of this within a company with teams, that people don't like change. I actually think people don't like uncertainty. They're fine with change. So one of the most important things I feel from a regulator's perspective is just be very clear on goals, on timeline, on scope. I think part of and we see this with Brazil, for example. Brazil and Mexico, I think, have given, especially Brazil, has given a very clear what we're now starting to talk about as open finance in the UK is de facto the mandate in Brazil, right? So it already encompasses mortgages and pensions and other financial products and not just payment accounts. It sets different mandates, dates for account aggregation, payment initiation, which makes sense if you think of these organizations having to mobilize teams internally. So that was a good decision. There's a sense of reciprocity. So in the sense that if you're consuming these APIs and you also have financial data yourself, that you're also exposing that data through APIs, which is reasonable. So first of all is learn by watching others. And to be honest, I think this is true for us. I like John Dewey, the American philosopher, state that people say they learn from experience, but psychology disagrees. People learn from reflecting on experience, right? It's not the experience itself that's enlightening. And I think it's important that regulators ourselves really reflect on these last 4 years. Because I think we've done great things. I think if you try to go back at when was the last time that an industry set standards and live environment of this size, you have to go back to like the late 60s and the creation of the move from Bank America to Visa to see authorization and capture and settlement being created all in SWIFT at the early 70s. In a space of 5 years, we created most of the standards that run at least the payments and remittance industry today. We're doing that with open banking right now. And in a way, I think more encompassing or in an even deeper way, because in these movements, we had a scheme, or we had this very clearly defined organization who led the whole implementation really, and then just banks just plug it in. I think we're now in a technically much more complex world where this is about 5,000 institutions in Europe, and now going global. So the scope of this is huge.
Absolutely. Yeah, it will take a little bit of time, but again, the platformization of the global economy is proceeding apace, and eventually every industry will be API enabled and able to be connected. And I guess also to your point, at some point, the banks will actually realize that consuming the APIs from other people can help them improve their processes. So Rafa, it's been a fantastic, quick survey of the open banking space. I could talk to you for hours on the subject, but really just to end off, I'd like to ask you in terms of your reflections on the pandemic and the impact that it's had on you, and any personal reflections in terms of what you've learned and what you will carry forward with you as a result of this period.
It's been an interesting, this whole Zoom way of doing business, right? And calling, it's actually the first week that I'm back in the office here in London. But talking to people directly at their homes is quite different, right? I think you kind of jump stages in breaking ice. And I've had some super interesting conversations with people in the industry about all sorts of topics. So I hope that I do more of that going forward, that we, back on the point of reflecting on experience, I think that's an even better like collective exercise. And I hope that we do more of this, that, industry events used to be this big thing that you get on a plane to do. And I hope that we do just more impromptu or higher frequency exchanges in the industry, because I think it's for the benefit of all of us.
And actually, I'm reflecting back on your comment about the learnings come from reflecting on the experience. Maybe it's too early to draw lessons from the pandemic because we're in the experience and haven't had time to reflect on it with some distance. But nevertheless, it's great to talk to you on the subject of open banking. You're one of the payment experts that I always admire and listen to in terms of your insights. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Tony. Always a pleasure.
Have a great day.
All the best.